hope you can hear me and see me also. That'd be cool. I would like to welcome you to this PR.co hosted webinar, which I personally named the storytelling stuff. But it's basically going to be Storytelling 101. I'm a business developer for PR.co. And also, so I do hope I know what I'm talking about if it comes to the writing. I'll be starting shortly, just waiting for a few more minutes to see if more people show up. If you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to ask them through either the chat. You can also ask them through Twitter, and then just tweet out to @pr.co, and I will answer through via Twitter. My name and Twitter handle is quite complicated to write to the PR.co. It's quite easier. Mind you, write it .dot. Otherwise, welcome. I hope you enjoy it. And thanks for showing up, of course. There we go. Question to help me out with something, because I have something that I would quite like you guys to help me think about, if that would make any sense whatsoever. Anyway, web current turns off and the story setting stuff will begin. So, storytelling and this storytelling stuff. We hear a lot about storytelling right now, also a lot about storytelling and branded content and content management, and it's all basically thrown into one big mismatch of what people think storytelling is, or that they should be storytelling, but they don't really know why. What I'm going to do throughout this webinar is I'm going to take back storytelling at first from branding and what you know as a company and what you want to be doing as a company, and take it back to the basis of storytelling on why stories are important, what the stories, because there's only a few stories, what those stories are, and only after that get back into how you can use storytelling and how you can start writing a good story. I have the my colleague here next to me who's asking if you can use a chat to confirm whether you're hearing me. I hope so. I'll just continue anyway. So, the storytelling stuff. Yeah, you can hear me. Awesome, thank you so much. And then, of course, I want to go down. Oh, there we go. The purpose of storytelling is rarely storytelling. The purpose of storytelling is a story itself. The trick is that people live in their own bubbles and live in their own heads, and the only way to empathize with other people is if we can imagine what it's like for them. And hearing a story and being told a story allows us to imagine. It allows us to draw the experiences of others into our own experiences, and thus show and feel empathy and emotion towards others. It's actually quite logical, yet not very often verbalized, or at least not often enough, if you ask me. So without imagination, there's no empathy, and you need a good story. Why? Because the good stories are remembered and the bad stories are ignored. As we all know, at this point in time, there are way too many stories online, and there's so much noise, and there's so much happening. So what you need to do is basically everything you can to stand out in telling your story and how you tell it, and mainly what you tell. I think the story itself, as I say here, is a purpose. It's the most important thing. Another thing that is taught to writers and playwrights and everything else is that stories have a basic structure, and there's a meta structure to everything. And I've had it here for you to see. There we go. A story is almost always, if not always, divided into different stages. The first stage is the anticipation stage, or the situation that a protagonist finds themselves in. And in the situation or anticipation stage, there is a conflict. And either the conflict arises during the stage, or it's already inherent in the actual situation itself. Something happens, something triggers the protagonist to do something about it, to change it, to fix it, which almost always begins with a sense of adventure and a sense of dreaming, a sense of invincibility in fixing the problem or the conflict. Well, no story would be a good story nor very truthful and realistic if the first try works. So usually this dream stage is followed by a frustration because the solution or the protagonist, either the solution isn't working or they encounter problems along the way, which leads to frustration, which escalates into a nightmare and escalates into the feeling that people cannot possibly overcome, or that the protagonist cannot possibly overcome the problems that are thrown in their way. And then in the end, there's a switch and there's a revolution. And there is, again, a trigger or something that changes that allows the protagonist to once again take control over the situation and in the end reach a solution, whether it be positive or negative. So these are the 6 stages that are often described as sort of the meta thing. This can be simplified, which I've done as well. Or into 3 straight stages. Basically, you have a situation or a conflict embedded in a situation. There's a struggle to do something about this conflict, and in the end, there's a solution. So these 3 things I will refer to later on in the presentation. So I'll have a slide again, don't worry, I'll show them to you. Just remember these 3 key things: the situation, the struggle, and the solution. They're inherent in every good story, in every salient blog, in anything that gets read, pretty much. So that's the basics of a story and how you write a story and how it's structured, pretty much. Then, in the theory of stories, there are a lot of people who disagree with this theory. I very much like it. There's the idea that there are only 7 stories, and that these 7 stories are retold by different authors and by different people in a different way every single time. So that in the end, it's not necessarily that everything is very, very well, every good story is special, and again, every good story is remembered, but the basic structure and what happens basically can be divided into 7 stories. And what I'd like you to do is these 7 stories, I will have there's examples of stories also, so that you sort of can imagine how the story goes and what it's like. And what I'd very much like you to do in as a thought experiment is see if you can think of real life examples, real life stories of companies or of executives or whatever that fit these narratives. I have a few in mind. I would very much love to hear what you guys think. So please chat it out, tweet it out, whichever form of communication you prefer. So the first 2 I will discuss right here are The Overcoming of the Monster and Rags to Riches. These are the first 2, the 7 basic plots once again, and basically they're stories that we see again and again. Overcoming the monster was the earliest known written story, the Epic of Gilgamesh, already. And then came Frankenstein, then came Dracula, and then came Jaws. And the overcoming of the monster goes with huge sacrifices in the nightmare stage, where there's a lot of bloodshed often, and a hero that has to think of great tricks in order to be able to save their people. The other one is Rags to Riches, and Rags to Riches is one that, especially in the startup world and the narratives, I encounter a lot. And it's as it says, Rags to Riches. You start poor, you build something, and then in the end you end up better off. It's the American dream. The fact that the American dream exists and is such a meme to be referred to already shows how central this theme is to human storytelling. And some of the examples of these stories are, for example, Aladdin, King Arthur, or Jane Eyre, or let's say, well, I mean, you could say Steve Jobs is Rags to Riches and Apple's the Rags to Riches. You could say it's Rebirth, which I'll come to in a bit. So please, if you have any thoughts on this, please let me know. I'd love to expand my thought, like comedy and the quest. Again, comedy, often in the problem and in the struggle, there's a lot of confusion leading to comical situations. Often confusion is funny, so people, well, so that refers to sort of this particular plot as one that recurs a lot. And for Weddings and a Funeral and A Midsummer's Night's Dream are two, one movie and one play that very much exemplify the confusion and how it can lead to ridiculous situation, and in the end, of course, be resolved and everything goes back to the way it's supposed to be, and normality is restored, which should be the end. Then The Quest is another one. Lord of the Rings and The Odyssey are two great examples of that, where the protagonist goes on a journey for whatever reason and evolves along the way of this journey in a particular way. Then there's Rebirth, which is Christmas Carol and Sleeping Beauty are two examples of that. It's how the protagonist or a person or the element of the story is changed after periods of absence or an evil spell. But there's a moment of standstill, pretty much. And there's A Voyage and Return, which is Alice in Wonderland and Orpheus. Again, the protagonist disappears for a while, but there's a lot that happens in a sort of parallel universe. So it's Christmas Carol could be seen as Voyage and Return as well, but Alice in Wonderland and Orpheus are more classical sort of themes to that story. And then finally we have tragedy, because of course what would a story be without a good tragedy once every so often? And in tragedy, the dream stage and the struggle, often the protagonist is drawn into making the wrong choices and going down a dark path, or a morally not so very certain or a morally conflicted path, and then ending in either a death wish and very often in death itself. Macbeth and Faust are two prime examples of the ultimate tragedies that have survived the test of time in how they're told. So these are the 7 plots and sort of the basis of what makes a story. Usually with SMART is to start defining the phases and seeing how a particular story is developing. Sorry. I did not intend to do that. And if you guys are up to speed with your TED Talks, then you've seen this man's face, and you will probably have seen this man's speech as well on Start With Why. Why do I bring in the Start With Why? Because the why is a step in the stages of a story that's often forgotten. because you need to define it before you can write it down. Um, Sorry, I got a little confused for a second. Um, oh, nice, 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 nice. So rags to riches, I get a lot. I will write them down as I expected, actually, because it's a very salient one. The American Dream again. We have WhatsApp, Journey and Return, Voyage and Return. We have Apple. Sorry, it's the same. Easy to see, but I mean it in a different way. And again, from awesome to nothing, awesome again. Apple is Voyage and Return. And in Rebirth, I would say, personally, Steve Jobs. Again, the person behind, I mean, Steve Jobs is the ultimate example on how the person behind the brand makes it salient, makes it an actual story to tell. I mean, he became larger than life when in the end he led a company. So, you know, again, so back to defining your story, because I'm eating up all the time. I only have half an hour. Get to the why. Because people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. Why do they buy why you do it? Because there's emotion involved and people want to empathize with what you say. So back to the stages of the story. You're at the end, so you need to get back to the beginning before you start telling your story. You're at the solution, or you may not be at the solution stage, you may be somewhere in the middle, but from the moment you're telling your story, you are at the solution stage, and you need to start working your way back in order to redefine why you started doing what you were doing. So you need to redefine the situation and the conflict, and the struggle that it takes you and has taken you to develop the product into what it is now, or your company or your personal life into what it is now. It's that procession that makes things relatable to people. So work your way back, and usually the best way to do that, if you're in a brand meeting or something, is to do it with people that you're working with, because everybody has different ideas about what the why is, and what the why is, and what the conflict actually is, and how it should be phrased as well. So this is a very good thing to do with other people around you to well, to help to start defining it properly. After you've done this, then you need to write it down, which is very obvious because you're obviously writing a story or telling a story, but in order to tell a story, you need to write it down. So you need to write it down, and then you need to leave it, and you need to walk away. Leaving it after a first draft is ultimately important. Why? This quote has been attributed to others, but I like it from Mark Twain. His apology: I didn't have time to write a short letter, so I wrote a long one instead. Writing a short, concise story takes time and takes editing and takes a lot of thinking, which is very often undervalued by the people that write it down, because it's such an emotional thing that they don't take the time they need to make it concise, to make it short. Saatchi said it, if your argument can be said in a few concise words, and maybe your argument isn't so good. So you need to take the time to make it concise. So I have a few small tips. I'm actually already almost at the end. It was short but sweet, I hope. So I have a few tips that I use a lot when I write, that can help you to write it down properly, that I have right here, and to keep it short and simple. And the most important one that I cannot stress enough is to avoid jargon and to avoid buzzwords. They creep into your language just because you work in a certain field or just because you hang out with certain people. Jargon and buzzwords are only understood by the people that you use them with and not by the rest of the world. And in the end, you want to convey your message to everybody. You want to make it understandable to everybody. So those things need to be avoided at all costs. The third point I've written down here is make your sentences short. Again, refers back to Mark Twain. Take the time to make your sentences short. The longer your sentences and the more commas and the more information you're trying to put in one phrase, the less clear it becomes. So take the time to shorten everything. Take the time to become best friends with the full stop, because the full stop should be your best friend. And don't be afraid to kill your babies when you're writing. What I sometimes do is I will have written something, and instead of never delete it, I will put it away and I will open a new blank page and start again. Because you get stuck in your words and you get stuck in your thoughts, and in order to get out of that, in order to write well, you need to be able to get out of that. And killing your babies is crucial. Things change, concepts change, so, well, yeah, again, change if you need to think about it properly. And then the last one, which is my above all, is be sincere. Mean what you say. Don't say things because you think you need to say them. Stick to your story. I think that's the most important one. And if you do that, then you get to the basis of who you are and what your company is and what your brand is. And if you have that basis, in a coherent and well-written story, then from there on, your brand can start truly developing. Finding a true customer base. That's it. The end. It's storytelling, so it must have a dramatic the end slide. That's all that I have to say, actually. If there's any questions or comments, then please ask them. And because I still have time for that. I'm getting a really cool one here. My company's in a boring market. Should I push it to find a narrative? There's always a narrative, regardless of the market you're in. If you're in a boring market, don't try and be sincere. Don't try and fake it. There's a story there, and it may not be a story that's going to have people run around screaming because it's the most exciting ever. But there's a story there, and even in the most. My grandfather used to say, if you stare at a brown bean for long enough, even brown beans become interesting. And I'm truly, truly convinced that this is true, and that this is true for any market and for any company. Just look at it long enough, think about it long enough, and there will be something there that you can write about and that you can use to make it salient. So another question I'm getting is, if my story is just average, how do I make it stand in front of editors and journalists? And is there anything beyond the narrative itself? Well, the best way to make your story stand before editors and journalists is by reaching out to them as a human being and reaching out to them with non-bullshit. I think that's key. Because journalists and editors, they get so much in their inboxes, and if your story is just average, then maybe it's not a good enough story to want to have published. You can tell your story in different ways. It doesn't necessarily have to be front page news. It can be front page news because, again, everything can be interesting enough if you just write it down right. But yeah. Yeah, sorry. I get questions now, and I'm not very good at multitasking. This is a flaw of mine, but it's a flaw that I have. So yeah, if your story is just average, I don't believe it, first and foremost, because I don't believe there's any story that's just average. And if you do want to stand out, best thing is personal contact with try and get in touch with the editors and journalists without being pushy. Because again, pushiness is often not very well received. Again, another one, hi, our company's narrative is very similar to our competitors, so it's very difficult to stand out. We don't have anything unique to offer. Find something unique to offer, because there's something that you can offer, and don't be afraid to look at the people in the company as well, because in the end, and especially if it's a small company and a startup, it's the people in the company that people are interested in and that people care about. The idea can be golden, but if the people behind it aren't, then it'll end in nothing. So there's always something that makes you unique. Find out what it is, and if it's, don't be afraid to look at the people behind the company rather than the company itself and the product itself. Because in the end, start with the why. It's not about the product that you make so much. It's about why you started making it to begin with. So, and your product can be services. Okay, so what I get now is, what are the consequences of changing your story? I work at a startup and we've pivoted several times. Should I worry about telling a different story if it's necessary? No, you shouldn't worry about, well, you should worry about telling a different story, and I don't think you should tell a different story ever. I'm going to go to the slides too. Go. The extended version. There are in this at least 3 stages where the protagonist is trying to fix the problem and is trying to address the situation in different ways. The pivoting and the making new decisions are part of the story and should be told as part of the story as well. If something doesn't work out and if you pivot, tell people why you've pivoted. Tell people what the thing is. So it's not about a different story, it's about a more extensive story. It's about keeping it to the real core of what it is. I hope that answers it. Is there more? Are there any more questions, or not at the moment? Well, if I hope if please let me know if I've answered your questions adequately, because I would like to know. It's hard talking without much spoken feedback. But interesting. I think this is it for now. Well, there's no more questions coming in, so I think I'm gonna say bye and I call it quits. I'm within the half an hour. I am quite proud of myself. I hope I won't have taken up more of your time than you expected. Thanks for joining in on the webinar. I hope you've enjoyed it. Feel free to oh, sorry. Feel free to, well, actually, I'd love some feedback. This is going to be on YouTube as well. So if you want to look back at the slides or stories, you can find them there. And you can always send me an email if you want more information about narratives and stories. You can send it to adine@pr.co, which you write ADINE@pr.co. Thanks for your time. And I hope everybody has